Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit, hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Schedule. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about pollinators and climate change with really a focus on what we can all do to address both of these concurrently. The Xerces Society is named after the first butterfly known to go extinct due to humans, the Xerces blue butterfly. Robert Michael Pyle, who founded the Xerces Society way back in '71, felt there should be an organization that focused on butterflies and other insects because they were often left behind by other conservation groups. We use a really holistic approach. We're a science-based organization that works on applied and community science to support all of our other work. Our outreach, education, advocacy is all based on that science. So I'm going to talk today about pollinators and climate change. I'm going to very quickly talk about importance, because I know you all know that. Very quickly talk about decline, because I think you all know that, and talk about threats a little bit more in detail with climate change as a focus. And then the majority of my talk is going to be about nature-based climate solutions, with some case studies. That really my goal is to just really talk about what we can do to deal with these twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. So why care about these animals? If you haven't been in talks like this before, just very quickly, so we're on the same page, they're really important. They provide incredible ecosystem services. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly an insect, to move pollen. If you like flowering meadows and flowers in your landscape and seeds and fruits, you can thank these animals. In fact, for us, they are really important. Out of 115 crops, 87 depend to some degree on pollination. That's about 1/3 of crop production globally, and these are the most nutritious, delicious foods that we can eat. But it's not just about us. These seeds and fruits, not necessarily our crops, but across landscapes, feed many animals. They rely on them. Think about songbirds and the seeds they eat at your feeder. Those seeds need to come from somewhere, and a lot of them do come from pollination, but they get them out in the wild as well. These animals also provide sustenance to songbirds and other animals because they eat them. It's odd, but Xerces tries to grow insect populations partly so they can be eaten by other animals. But 96% of songbirds rear their young on invertebrates, and things like caterpillars, those flower visitors, are a very important part of their diet. I like to point out grizzly bears because they're not totally pollinator obligate, but they're insect obligate. They feed on two major food groups. One is salmon. They would not have those salmon without small insects and other invertebrates where those salmon are born that live in the streams. The second major food source is berries, and they would not have that without insect pollinators. So this is really grizzly bears, brown bears are insect obligate animals. The dollar value of services provided by native insects in today's dollars, or 2020 dollars anyway, is about 7 billion per year to the United States. And that's a lot. We would lose a lot if we lose these animals. But unfortunately, these animals are in decline. And I'm really not going to belabor this. If we could do a whole webinar on the studies that show that these animals are declining. Study after study after study show that they're in trouble. And the United Nations published a compendium, a large report a few years ago that showed that potentially more than 40% of invertebrate pollinator species could be facing extinction in the coming years, particularly bees and butterflies. And it's not just our pollinators, it's our insects generally. This paper came out in the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences last year, or in 2021, and showed that where studied, these animals are declining across the board. Declining is somewhere around 1 to 2% a year. A 2% annual decline is approximately 30% decline in 20 years. That's huge. This means many fewer insects to pollinate, for birds to fish, or birds and fish to eat, and for all these other services that they provide. And what's causing this? Well, unfortunately, it's us. Likely the most influential issue is direct habitat loss. We like to grow our crops, we like to live our lives in a way that excludes habitat for wildlife, not just pollinators, but for all wildlife from our landscapes. And we really need to change that. And then unfortunately, we've got habitat loss, and often right next door, we have habitat degradation. So we may have areas that are not fully developed, yet they might be overgrazed or overmowed or have too many invasive plants and many other issues that are affecting them. It's the 1-2 punch of loss and degradation of habitat. And then there's pesticides. And although I said, I say sometimes that pesticides are second only to habitat loss, I'm not 100% sure of that. They're a major, major, major driver of the decline of pollinators and other invertebrates. And there's a lot of use on farms and for mosquito control. But what a lot of people don't realize is we use pesticides all over the place, even on our public lands and wildlands. We spray millions of acres of toxic pesticides to control native insects like grasshoppers on rangeland across the West. In 2021 alone, more than 1 million acres was sprayed in Montana to control native insects. And these pesticides also harm our aquatic insects and our pollinators. We also use them in the built spaces, our towns and cities. USGS has found that where places they've studied, they sometimes find that more pesticides are used in urban and suburban areas than they are on farms. And this is in the quest for the perfect lawn and the perfect rows. It's all cosmetic, and it may be what the pesticide use that drives me the craziest. Anyway. But there are many other issues. We've got disease. We tend to move animals across the land, across nations, right? And commercial bumblebees are moved from Europe to other countries. We move commercial bumblebees from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast. These can spread diseases, and they can interfere with native bumblebees. We also move honeybees around the landscape. And honeybees are important for pollination of agriculture, but they can be a real problem if we're putting them in wild areas that these native bees need to survive. You don't think of lights, but, and I could go on and on and on, but this is the last one before I get to climate change. Moths are really important pollinators. There are 10 times as many species of moths as butterflies, and they pollinate a lot of plants. And lights are really impacting these animals. So many, many threats. But climate change is this sort of 10,000-pound gorilla that, I like gorillas, by the way, so I guess I need to come up with a different term, that overlays everything, right? And studies suggest that climate change is becoming, and may have become already, a major driver in decline of pollinators. And certainly it's driving species like the Uncompahgre fritillary here. This is a butterfly I worked on. It only lives above 13,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains of southern Colorado. And as climate continues to warm, it just may no longer exist. But it's not just high mountain endemics. It's wet meadow species like skippers, where these wet meadows are drying out because of climate change. It's species that live in coastline habitat as oceans rise. It's many other species across the board. So we need to rejigger if you're thinking, oh, it's these animals that live on the mountaintops. A study from 2018, a modeling study that didn't look at pollinators, but it looked at invertebrates. Looked at the distributions of different invertebrate taxa under different climate scenarios, under basically different temperatures. And what they found was that with warming of 1.5 degrees C above what pre-industrial levels, 6% of invertebrates were estimated to lose half of their ranges. If we go to 2 degrees C, we're losing, 18% of invertebrates are losing half of their ranges. And if we end up at 3.2 C, half of invertebrates will be gone from half of their current ranges. That is startling, and we need to address climate change because these animals are so important. Later studies have found that we're seeing climate change is now a major driver of decline for a broad suite of butterfly species. A study in the journal Science in 2021 found that all groups of butterflies, all families of butterflies are declining, even butterflies that we think are common. So some of our common species are starting to fall out of the system. They found a 1.6% decline, and climate change is an annual decline in these butterflies, and climate change is a major driver. Studies are also showing this is an issue with bumblebees, including the American Western bumblebee. This study just came out just a couple months ago. And species are starting to move across the landscape. And I shouldn't say starting. Animals always have had to move across the landscape to find, their habitat resources, to find a mate, to escape predation. But species are moving more across the landscapes as habitats change due to climate change, due to really the climate crisis. And the rate of change of climate across the landscape is predicted to exceed the maximum speed that many pollinator groups can disperse or migrate. And what makes it worse is the compounded impact of climate change driving more movement and habitat loss and degradation that impedes movement of these animals across the landscape. It really complicates the picture. I do want to point out that, the idea of poleward or, upward to higher elevations view of species range shifts is a little bit of a simplification, especially with our land use and with changes in precipitation. Climate change is not uniform. And a colleague of mine coined the term that never really was highly used as climate destabilization. We're seeing more droughts, we're seeing more wet, we're seeing greater storms. It's warmer in the spring, it's colder in the spring, it's all these different things. And that will really determine how these animals can move across the landscape, or if they will move across the landscape, on top of do they have habitat to move into. And there's really evidence that this extreme weather caused by climate change is already having implications for insects. It's certainly impacting some of our restoration efforts. This is a restoration that Eric Mader, who works for Xerces, he's the co-director of the Pollinator program, worked on some years ago. This is an island in the Columbia River. And when I know they started looking at this restoration, this had not flooded in decades. And they were looking at an upland sort of prairie mix for this restoration. And as they were planning it, it flooded twice in, I think, 2 years. Eric had to go back to scratch and go, what type of plants will be able to handle dry periods but also some inundation. So this extreme weather is affecting animals and our efforts. And fire is one of the biggest. We're seeing fires that are larger, hotter, the fire season's longer. This is happening everywhere, but especially in the West. This is catastrophic for our pollinator species. Now, I do want to point out, because some people will point this out and go, well, this species is doing great. Some species, at least in the short term, will benefit from climate changes, those that are able to move across the landscape. But the majority of species are not able to adapt fast enough. And even in the long term, these species that are able to move now, if we see those worst climate projections, they'll be likely in trouble too. But what this says is that community composition is expected to change. We're going to see upwards populations of certain species, downward populations of other species. And I'm going to talk about diversity in just a minute, but diversity is key because we need as many species on the landscape as possible so that we have species that are still in this landscape as we see changes in climate change. Now, studies seem to suggest that bumblebees and butterflies are more prone to local and regional extinction than some other species. And this model by Kerr et al. In 2015 suggests that bumblebees may not be able to, move north like many other species of animals as the climate changes. And the other really concerning thing that will compound these issues is that species are really getting disjointed from each other. Our pollinators from the plants they pollinate, our birds from the insects they eat. With spring coming earlier, certain species adapt to that faster than others. This may mean that birds don't have those caterpillars to eat. And remember, 94% of songbirds need insects to feed their young. They need them. It's not just a suggestion. And if we decouple these issues and have fewer of them, we're going to see these compounding impacts. And really, at the end of the day, Dave Wagner, who wrote that paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, coined the term death by 1,000 cuts. You'll see this, that the top part is all climate change related issues, but we have habitat loss and insecticides and industrial agriculture, introduced species, urbanization, all of these other issues. So now that I've depressed you and it's too early to just go and knock back tequila shots, I'm going to talk about solutions because I really believe we have the solutions we need to address these twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. What we need is the political and societal will to do it. So that's our charge today in partnership, is how can we take concepts really over the next 2 days? How can we take the concepts you're going to hear over the next 2 days and expand them and get other people to help be part of the solution? So I'm going to focus on what are called nature-based climate solutions. And these nature-based solutions basically involve conserving, restoring, or better managing ecosystems to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the idea is that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to land use. You can capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But the cool thing is you can do both of those things while providing for biodiversity. You can improve the resilience and functioning of these ecosystems, helping plants and animals, and humans or animals, adapt to climate change. And this work can be really meaningful. A study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found nature-based climate solutions could contribute about 20% of the mitigation needed between now and 2050 to keep global warming under 2 degrees C. And that's nothing to sneeze at. And at the same time, we're keeping carbon in the ground. We are also helping biodiversity. I like to say that it's really climate change and biodiversity is really a win-win or lose-lose. Because the science is clear. Climate change and biodiversity really are linked. We have to have these ecosystem-based approaches as part of the solution. It's really impossible to address biodiversity loss without addressing climate change. You saw that model. Even without land use changes, we potentially could see a lot of decline in insects just from climate change alone. But it's equally impossible to tackle the full impacts of climate change without this biodiversity in the landscape. Now, if we want to maintain biodiversity and mitigate climate, we really need to focus on climate and drought adaptive native plant systems. You know, it's funny, Xerces is a insect or invertebrate conservation organization. And yet a lot of our work is working on plants, because plants and insects are really what I like to say are the fabric of the planet. We might be able to go along, you know, and I don't want to do this, don't get me wrong. I love grizzly bears and tigers and all of these wonderful mammals and birds. We need them. But it's really, I think, in a lot of cases, the insects and the plants that are driving these systems. Now, meadow species are really great. These deep-rooted plants that will persist in different environmental scenarios and store carbon. But shrubs and trees are also part of the solution, as I'll talk about in a minute. But the key is diversity. Diversity is vital. Diversity of plants supports a diversity of insects, which in turn support a diversity of other wildlife. And this insect diversity is needed if you want to maintain those ecosystem functions. If you want pest control, pollination, food for wildlife, we have to have insect diversity, which goes along with this plant diversity. This biodiversity buffers the impacts of climate change. So it provides an array of microclimates or refuge, which serve as a place that insects can be during heat waves or other extreme weather. And maintaining more insect species will really buffer also against the loss, as some species will be better under different changing climates, as I alluded to earlier. So diversity, 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 that's what we need. And it also, this diversity enhances genetic variation, which is really vital for resilience under climate change. We also need to connect landscapes. As I mentioned earlier, animals are moving more now than they did in the past. Again, I want to point out they always needed to move, but climate change may be driving them to move even more. And connectivity across the landscape is really vital, especially in areas where we don't have a lot of natural habitat. But it's not all about flowers. We have to deal with pesticides to address climate and biodiversity. I'm going to say it again. We have to deal with pesticides to address climate and biodiversity. And we've got to minimize pesticide impacts in all of these landscapes. It's great to put out flowers, and a lot of people want to put out flowers. But if we're putting out flowers in places that these animals are still impacted by pesticides, we may be doing some good, but we're not doing nearly as much good as we could. Now, there's study after study that show that pesticides are a leading threat to the conservation of insects, and they move far beyond our field borders. But what some people don't know is the production and use of pesticides are also a significant source of greenhouse gases. The Pesticide Action Network of North America, PANA, just put out a really interesting report that details how much carbon is put into our atmosphere through the production and use of a variety of different pesticides. Check out, if you go to their website, you can find that report. So we have to deal with these chemical inputs along with diversifying and maintaining and diversifying, managing our habitats. And we have to deal with the bad actors, right? These highly toxic, highly, systemic, long-lived things like neonics. But to truly do this, we've got to move beyond this pesticide a treadmill that we seem to be on. We get rid of a pesticide, a new one comes on. Got to move to a more ecologically based approach, truly ecologically based approach to address these issues. Oh, can somebody say something, because I seem to have had a problem here.
Yes, your screen is back to the beginning, so you'll need to go to slideshow.
I'm gonna get right back to where I was. It is saying, let's see, resume slideshow. There we go. All right, now we can move on. And sorry about that, people. We seem to have a bug in the system, and I like bugs, but not in that context. So if we hope to address climate change and biodiversity loss, we also have to deal with all landscapes. We got to work across all landscapes. And this includes natural areas. Natural areas are really, I like to think of them as the glue that holds everything together. These natural areas can act as refuge from climate change and a haven for vulnerable species. And we can manage natural areas in a way that minimizes impacts and maximizes benefits. And it's not just forests. I know a lot of people think plant trees, plant trees, plant trees. This is what we hear all the time, and that our forests we have to protect. We do. But protecting and managing all natural spaces is going to help insects and capture carbon. And one thing I want to point out is protecting and managing existing habitat is often more efficacious and almost always less expensive than restoring habitat. So we do need a real focus on that. And there are ways to use fire, to graze, to mow in a way that maximizes resources for pollinators and other animals. And we need to, I'm just going to say it one more time, but we need to address pesticides. We can't continue to spray millions of acres across our wildlands as well as other landscapes and address this issue. So we've got our wildlands we need to focus on. But there are lots of lands outside of wildlands that also need our focus. And one of them is roadsides. As we move towards electric vehicles, or better yet, all riding bicycles, we can make our roadsides much more climate friendly and biodiverse friendly. There are 10 million acres of roadsides in the US, and if properly managed and restored, they could be great for pollinators. Ton of resources on our website for those of you who work with DOTs or might be with the DOT. Jennifer Hopwood on our staff is really a global expert in the restoration and management of roadsides. So reach out, get some information there. We also need to work in towns and cities. 80% of us live in a town or a city. And the neat thing about pollinator or insect conservation, it can happen at any scale. You can, do this to your yard and you're going to see quite incredible diversity show up. It's amazing how that can happen. Now, urban meadows are beautiful and can provide valuable habitat while capturing carbon. This is a photo from the Urban Meadow nonprofit. They promote urban meadows. But we do need trees. And trees really play a vital role in climate change and in managing for climate change. They moderate temperature, moisture, stormwater buffering, water quality control, but we have to move to diversify our tree canopy, and we have to do it now before more invasive insects or invasive diseases start to kill the trees in our neighborhood. We need a diversity of trees, ideally drought tolerant native trees planted in our neighborhoods. And we need to retool now because trees take decades to grow. We also, in towns and cities, I think, neglect this shrub layer. We often focus on meadows or we focus on trees. And I am promoting, and Xerces is starting to promote, and some cities are starting to promote lots more shrubs in these landscapes. Think of what you can plant along a street under a power line. You could plant a beautiful hedgerow that won't impact the power line, but provides for carbon capture and for biodiversity. And I'm going to do a couple case studies of some work that Xerces does with partners across the United States. And the first is Bee City USA. Bee City USA is a platform that allows cities and campuses to tap into resources to take action on pollinator conservation. Xerces worked with the founder, Phyllis Stiles, who's amazing, to onboard this program in 2018 or 19. And we now have over 325 cities and campuses as part of this network. And the work they're doing is highly meaningful. I'm going to take a drink. These partners have completed more than 2,500 pollinator habitat projects since 2019, and more than 180 affiliates took concrete action to reduce pesticides. They also have a big reach. Excuse me. Our Bee cities and campuses have reached over 1 million people since 2019. We don't even have the data actually in for all of last year, so these numbers will go way up. We also partner with other municipalities. One city we've partnered with for a number of years is the city of Boulder. They're a leader in pollinator conservation and climate resilience and climate mitigation. And Boulder has a really holistic approach. They're working to connect tree canopies to cool the city. They're working on pollinator pathways, and they're trying to promote more absorbent landscapes. And working with them, we're hoping to train 200 pollinator advocates and integrate biodiversity into 20% of landscapes across the city. It's really an exciting project with really great partners. We're also working in Santa Fe on the Santa Fe Pollinator Trail to build connected, climate smart pollinator habitat. The goal is to have habitats throughout areas of the city that don't have much habitat, to connect these habitats as much as possible. This helps our pollinators, it helps other wildlife, and it helps the residents that never had much green landscapes in their communities. It's really a win-win-win-win as far as I'm concerned. So we've got natural areas, roadsides, towns and cities, but if we're going to be successful, we also have to work in agriculture. And about 40% of land use on our planet is agriculture, so it's really vital. Unfortunately, we still see way too much fence row to fence row farming, pesticides and chemical fertilizers, soil degradation, and everything that goes with that. And we need to continue to grow our community to have more regenerative farming, agroecology, ecological intensification. We've got many, many incredible farmers that are pushing the envelope out there, but we need to try to mainstream these ideas as much as possible to get to these solutions. Now, ag restoration is vital if we want to recover insects and deal with climate change. And many nature-based climate solutions can be geared towards agriculture. We can protect biodiversity or increase biodiversity and help with climate change in ag landscapes. Now, things like reduced tillage and diversified crop rotations and cover crops are vital. And we really need to keep promoting them. But if we want to truly make agriculture climate smart, we need to also focus on permanent habitat in and around farms. And there are lots of ways to do this. Flowering hedgerows, many other practices. And flowering hedgerows are really an important piece of this puzzle. They can capture carbon. They can provide for a variety of animals, and they're really important. I, unfortunately, because we were cutting time, am going to run out of time. I have about 10 minutes left, but they're saying about 5 minutes. So I'm going to go really fast here, and I apologize for that. I was thinking I had 45 minutes, but we're going to try to make up some time here. So a recent study in California concluded that installing hedgerows on 50 to 80% of California's farmland would capture so much carbon, it would help the state to reach 12% of its ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. And our team has been working on hedgerows for a long time, developing climate smart plants that will grow in different, from drought to extreme weather. And the idea is to go from this to that. And these are in landscapes often that don't have much habitat. And some of these hedgerows are huge. This is a little truck down here, just to show you the scale. And I do want to point out a quick case study, and I'll try to go quick, that, we did a study recently with the University of Nevada, Reno, that showed that we can maximize field borders and minimize pesticide use, and that will add significantly to connectivity in California's Central Valley. This is the valley. It had lots of habitat. It now has very little habitat left. It also has some intense pesticide use in farms as well as in cities and towns. And we used a tool, we developed a tool that looked at both land use, lethality from pesticides, and expert opinion to determine how and if we could put field margin habitat across the valley. And it's unique because we use pesticides as a part of our resistance. Think about it. If an animal's trying to move through a pesticide-laden landscape and it dies, or it has sublethal impacts and can't make it, that is a form of resistance. So our study just found, I'm going to go really quickly, I can get you this paper for anybody who wants, that we can do this in this system by improving margins and decreasing pesticide use. We can provide over 1 million acres of habitat that connects across the valley. Another very quick case study are efforts in the driftless area that I won't go into in detail because I don't have time. But this is a project that Practical Farmers of Iowa, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Xerces has worked on. And the idea is to bring climate smart practices into this landscape to add to the existing great work that's been going on there. And I do want to read a quote because I thought this was such a good quote. This is from a blog on the PFI website from Angela Smith of Middle Fork Farm. In the 10 years that we've been on the farm, we've seen 5 significant flood events punctuated by severe droughts. She says, I'm crazy about native plants and native ecosystems. Throughout the drought, the native plants were still thriving and birds and insects were still there, all without my help. That's the idea, folks, is to do this on landscapes across the United States, across North America, and across the world. So a couple very quick final thoughts. I've mentioned partnerships. My take-home message is we need more of them. We have to partner with our farmers, our local communities, our other nonprofits. Coordination and communication are really keys. I do want to point out, though, that there are people that have been historically left out of conservation, and we really do need to bring them in with us. This conservation biodiversity, all people need to be actively seen. The conservation community, and I'm going to put Xerces right at the front, we need to continue to improve how we do this, has a lot of work to do to grow inclusivity so that all people feel welcome in our work. And we have to practice reciprocity. We have to actually see people where they are and work with them. Now, anybody can be part of this. You don't even need a landscape. You can become a community scientist if you can and feel, if you have the pocketbook for this, support organic and sustainable agriculture. Take action to curb your carbon footprint. Eat less meat, especially factory farmed meat, and eliminate unneeded travel. Support candidates that care about science and conservation, because we can't and shouldn't be on the hook to do this all ourselves. We have to have cities. We have to have our federal government. We have to have states. The good news is that it works. We have so much data to show that if we manage, restore, protect, deal with pesticides, we can improve the situation for insects and for overall biodiversity. So do this in your yard, on your farm, get others to do it. And really that's the thing. I think we have the tools, we have the knowledge, we just need the societal will, and a group like this can help make that happen. So I'm really excited for your next 2 days of seeing the incredible talks moving forward. We've got a variety of resources, and I will leave it at that.